Well, welcome back from the break, everyone. My name is Elisabeth Barajas. I am the Director of Globalization at Purdue Polytechnic Institute at Purdue University in West Lafayette, Indiana. I am happy to be here. That's a mouthful. And thank you so much to our hosts and for Stefan and all of the work and Daniela and Sylvie for all of the work put together today to make this possible. Now, when we first started talking about this, my role as an administrator, right, and supporting faculty and the concept of producing COIL experiences. I had to have Colin here. Okay, so I'd like to introduce Dr. Colin Gray. He is a colleague of mine in Purdue. And the principle of this is that I can't do this alone. Not the presentation. I mean, I can do the presentation alone. Okay, but it wouldn't be authentic because it's really a team effort amongst the faculty, the lecturers, and the administration. Now, a little bit of linguistic background here is that when I say faculty within the American English context, I don't mean school as in a group of studies. I mean our professors that are teaching the students and doing the research. So Colin, would you like to introduce a little bit about your background?
Yeah, absolutely. So hi, I'm Colin Gray. I'm an associate professor in the Polytechnic Institute in the Department of Computer Graphics Technology. I lead an undergraduate and graduate program in user experience design. If anybody needs translation on what that looks like, hopefully it'll become a little bit more clear in certain parts of the presentation. And I've worked with Elisabeth over the last, I'm in my 8th year now at Purdue, and I've worked with Elisabeth, I think since year one or two,
yeah, absolutely.
On various global activities. And then when it came to the pandemic, we found new ways of collaborating that I don't think either of us anticipated.
No, absolutely. And so that's what we're going to share is our dialogue about how we work together as a team to figure out how my enthusiasm meets his reality. So a little bit of background, especially for our colleagues in the room and online that are less familiar with where Purdue University is. So Andrea had mentioned that she lives in New York, but works at Purdue. We're not close to New York. So it takes a couple hours in an airplane to get there. And so on the screen, you'll see that Purdue University is located in West Lafayette, Indiana. We're in the state of Indiana in the Midwest region of the country. Usually when people are unfamiliar with our geography, we say that we are just a couple hours southeast of Chicago. Okay, so if you can find all the Great Lakes, you can kind of pinpoint where we are located. Okay. This is really important within our context because Purdue University is enormous. Okay, so we have just over, we're at record enrollment right now, correct? Yeah. Just over 50,000 students. Okay, so it's an enormous institution. Okay, it's very international. We have close to a quarter of our students, and it goes back and forth each year, that are international students from a variety of countries. Our faculty, meaning our professors, are very international. And there's a lot of different activities that circle around culture, international activities. We have traditional study abroad, etc. And that'll become important on why I mentioned that later on. Within the context of our entire university, we're a comprehensive R1 research intensive university. Colin and I represent one of the academic colleges. Okay, so we have a College of Agriculture that is very well known. Okay, we have a College of Veterinary Medicine, but our college is called the Polytechnic Institute. Okay, we are a STEM college. And we are an eclectic STEM college. So this is always a challenge, I'm sure just as much for you as for me. And so our students study in a variety of different departments and schools, right? And they can do everything from get a bachelor's degree in professional flight technology and then become airline or military pilots. They can do aviation management. We have cybersecurity and network and databasing degrees in our computer information technology. We have degrees in construction management technology. We have engineering technology. Those are ABET accredited degrees in mechanical engineering technology, electrical engineering technology, mechatronics, robotics, audio, engineering technology. So the whole gamut, technology, leadership, and innovation. Okay, so this is our kind of business focused side of that. So human resource development, organizational leadership, okay, which is oftentimes a good jive and a nice complement to the business schools in Europe. Okay. And lastly, computer graphics technology. So I'll let you go through what all that encompasses.
Yeah, and we have lots of eclectic players in the computer graphics technology department as well. So I lead our user experience design program, but we have people that do building information modeling, virtual product integration, game design, animation, data visualization, web dev. So lots of different people, lots of different players coming from lots of different perspectives.
Yeah, and we talk about all of this because in my role as an administrator, it's a very broad set of offerings. And in the capacity of matchmaking and assisting faculty, there's a lot going on. So today, like I had mentioned, a little bit of humor, okay, which as we know goes a long way. I don't have any gummy bear jokes though, okay, but as an administrator, I can be really enthusiastic about all of my global projects. And I am extremely enthusiastic about all of my global projects. But at some point, it's going to hit the reality of capacity and the situation and the effort and the enthusiasm and the willingness and all of those other factors that my faculty members are going to have. So today we're going to talk about that. My perspective, Colin's experience, right? How we advocate for COILs within our college, a STEM college, and how important it is to speak the language of data, right, in your advocacy. And then we'll talk resources and leveraging networks. Okay, so here's the view from my desk. So traditional mobility paused, right? Oftentimes in the US higher ed landscape, when we talked about international programs, global programs, they were very much mobility based, okay? Oftentimes dependent. At Purdue University, right, 70% of our students do not travel abroad. Right? So only about 30% of our students have an actual physical mobility experience. Right? And that's pretty common for R1 research institutions, STEM students, right, across the board. And so what we noticed when even that 30% was sent home, that we had a lack of online options, right? That we had an increase of online activity in virtual employment, right? That intercultural competencies were still needed, right? Just because you're on a screen, you still have to deal with difference. Right? And that we had equity issues in our traditional programming. I think we always knew, right, in higher ed that there's a big equity issue with traditional mobility programming. Right? It's not something I think we need to talk about it more, right? But we had an opportunity. Right, Colin, you want to hit this one?
Yeah, so we already had some stuff in place and we actually evolved some of these attributes very, very quickly during the pandemic as well. So we're a very active learning focused college. We already had a lot of curricula that were focused on project-based learning, collaborative work, and sometimes in very flexible configurations that allowed us to engage with industry sponsors, engage with other emerging projects and other interdisciplinary work. So we already had that. That was great. We also had some intercultural competency initiatives and resources that were already available through SILMAR, and then that was really activated through the Office of Globalization. And it was something that was already something that we were focusing on, but maybe not as much as we could. We were saying, well, the study abroad is sort of dealing with some of those issues.
Agreed.
We're getting better at that though.
We're getting better.
We also had some online platforms. We had our learning management system, but of course, during the pandemic, all of these other resources sort of exploded and grew in terms of their ability. And so we'll be talking about a few today. Zoom is sort of the obvious one for connecting via video conference. It's how all of you are joining us today virtually. But also within the UX space, we were able to adopt some other tools. The most important one for us was called Miro. It's fantastic. It's a digital whiteboard. It's an infinite virtual whiteboard. You can have 100 people on there at the same time doing stuff. And that ended up becoming our replacement for a learning management system in the era of the pandemic. And finally, we had faculty and students that were hopefully staying resilient in the face of all of these pressures, just like everyone was around the world. We had engaged with students to figure out how we can better support them and keep them from feeling isolated as they often joined classes in their dorm rooms. And of course, as faculty, we needed an outlet as well to make sure that we were all staying mentally healthy as well as continuing to learn.
Absolutely. So this was the ask. So I knew Colin had already been involved with international partners, doing work, designing programs. Colin was an easy target. Okay, and I say that in the most, the most professional way. And so as we started to look at increasing our number of COILs and to really get some new initiative going, okay, we had to start with commencing COILs. And so I really went to Colin, right, because it was an easy place to start. And let's not recreate the wheel if we don't have to. And so Colin's going to talk a little bit about his experience and expectations, and we're going to kind of ping it back and forth as a dialogue.
Yeah.
Okay.
And Elizabeth's going to interrupt me if I can.
Yes, I do. I'm an overlapping communicator, so.
And I'm not, but we found that the diversity actually works.
Yep.
So totally good. So prior to the pandemic, I had established and then built up two international partnerships. One with colleagues at Beijing Normal University and People's Republic of China with a parallel program in UX design at the graduate level. We also had partnerships that we had developed in Newcastle upon Tyne in the north of England with Newcastle University and Northumbria University there. So those partnerships existed. My husband and I had traveled, he teaches with me, had traveled to China multiple times. We were planning a study abroad for spring of 2020. That obviously didn't go down very well. And we also had taken a couple of study abroad trips over to Newcastle with students previously. So all that's sort of the context that we came in with this request about a potential COIL.
Yeah, and as Colin and I were hashing this out and we were starting to think about and reflecting on our experience a few years ago as we looked at this, I said, okay, now which ones were the really important topics? Because I came at you with an ask, I came at you with support. And so those really important topics is we're going to use a word that we use commonly in English called right sizing. So Colin, what does it mean to right size?
So right sizing as a faculty member is the world is coming down around you. What do I have capacity to do? I'm already trying to take care of my students on campus. How much more is the ask going to be? And is it the right size of effort for what I'm able to give at that point? It needs to be small enough that it's manageable for me, but it needs to be enough that administration who are giving us funds to actually execute these things can trust that I'm actually going to do something meaningful.
Yeah.
And so finding that balance was really, really important early on in that email exchange and then some face-to-face conversation as well.
And I think that as an administrator is a key takeaway. And so I have a certain capacity in my daily hours of work. It's not the same as my faculty members and their capacity. And so understanding that I need to have that flexibility to allow them the autonomy to right size something for their personal capacity is really important.
Yeah, so the expectation was very reasonable, even in the middle of the pandemic. So all they asked for was a one-pager. We like one-pagers. So I was able to put this together really quickly, ping it over to my international partner over in Beijing, and they're like, yeah, that sounds great. This was actually for fall. We started this in the spring of 2021 with two different projects, both of which failed in different ways. And we were able to pull some of those learnings forward for this one. And it became much, much easier by the time I was on my third COIL. The reporting ask was also minimal. There was not a lot of oversight. There was a lot of trust in this relationship. And I knew that I was going to have to provide some reporting, just like we had done for mobility programs previously, but it wasn't anything that felt massive or overwhelming as part of the process.
No, I mean, those dialogues were really something that we utilized also as a method of checking in, making sure, seeing that he was getting the support from me that was necessary, pivoting aspects that weren't working, and it was just the right amount.
Yeah, and it was a negotiation as well, because there were people at Elisabeth's level and there were also people at the university level that were engaged, and they were trying this out for the first time as well. And so we were all trying to sort of test each other out and figure out, like, are we willing to go on this adventure together? And the answer was yes, let's do it.
Yeah, it's a little bit, when you have a push-pull, you ultimately land on the appropriate spot.
Yeah.
For sure. So
the extra,
because let's face it, as an administrator, I come up with ideas, projects. I reach out to faculty and I say, hey, this is great. Our students need this. I'm enthusiastic. Can you do this? By the way, it's extra work. And I have to be honest about that.
Yeah.
And that's one of my personal philosophies, is that I'm not going to tell someone that it's not going to take extra effort. But we can have that dialogue, talk about why I'm asking for it, why the students need it, and then listen to the concerns, the benefits. And I think that you talked a little bit about a benefit that I didn't even think about at the beginning.
Yeah, we actually found some benefits that we didn't really realize in the moment. And as a faculty member, I mean, I get probably 10 requests for additional extra things that would be really fun a week. Like, if I had unlimited time, there'd be lots of things to fill up that space. But there were some reasons why I felt like this was worth the extra. So one big one was that we had engaged deeply with our students. We were engaging in some co-design work with them. We had surveyed them to figure out early in the pandemic, like what's giving them heartburn, what's causing them stress, and what can we do about it? And we had a lot of students who were planning on going to two study abroad trips, one to China, one to Newcastle, who were really sad they weren't going to have that experience. And there were lots of others who just felt really isolated and needed an escape. And so this was a really logical way to replace some of that mobility and give people that chance for escape and an outlet.
Absolutely.
The research benefit, I think, was also important for us because as a faculty member, I was pre-tenure at the time. I needed to show research productivity. And so this was also a really logical way to say, there's something cool that we're doing for the first time. Nobody knows what's going on. I bet that we can build some new knowledge in the process as well.
Yeah, and to kind of ground that in the US higher ed system. So tenure is a process that our lecturers, our faculty go through, right? And it's an intense process. And there's certain things that are valued, other things that perhaps are less valued. And so finding those types of activities that are valued for my faculty members that are going through the tenure process is really important.
Or mapping the value.
Or mapping the value, absolutely. Okay. So he did the one pager. His partners were like, sure, let's do it. Why not? Let's go. Okay. Now we got to the during the COIL experience. Okay. At this point, as an administrator, I'm a little bit hands off. Okay. And so we got things started and now I'm not in the classroom. So it's up to me trusting my colleagues. So Colin, how did that go?
So it's sort of a tale of two semesters. So we started out in spring of 2021 with two projects with two partners, one in Beijing, one in Newcastle, and both of them became dumpster fires in different ways. Because that's just how collaborations during the middle of the pandemic happen.
Let it go.
Let it go. With China, we were misaligned with schedules because our academic calendar was different than theirs, which started really after Chinese New Year. So we were able to get them for one meeting before Chinese New Year, and then there was a long pause while the Purdue team was sort of doing their own thing, and then we re-engaged afterwards.
And our semester had started in January.
Yeah, our semester started in January. With the collaborations in Newcastle, we lost a lot of people on the Newcastle side for various reasons that were out of our control, and so the teams became really imbalanced. We still learned things, students still did good work, but it didn't feel quite right. And we were actually also relying upon Silmar's office to provide intercultural pedagogy training that was sort of separate from the disciplinary content. And so we recognized there are some things that we can do better. Being okay with just in time became sort of my byline, and being adaptable and figuring out what we could do differently. And so after that end of that first semester, we had some frank conversations with the students that participated. And we're like, what worked and what really, really sucked about this experience, because we want to do better. We want to figure out a different way of doing this. And it's important to note that on the Purdue side, we had a course container prior to the pandemic that already existed, where we ran multiple projects every semester in a vertically integrated active learning environment. So what that means practically is that we, in every spring, had students at 4 different educational levels. We had first year, second year, and third year undergraduate students, and we had post-grad students enrolled as well.
Yeah, so Colin's mentioning an example that was touched upon earlier about mixing your undergraduate students and your what we would call graduate students, post-grad students together. And so what works for one scenario may not work for another.
Absolutely.
And I think that this is a prime example of, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So our undergraduate students take this experience 5 times. And so we offer this every semester. So we offered these as 2 out of about 12 projects in spring of 2021. The rest were just with traditional industry sponsors. And then we got a chance to try it again in fall of 2021 with a new project team and a new configuration. And go ahead.
So I have a quick question. So would you call this compulsory?
It would be compulsory because this is a required course for students in our UX design program. And it actually worked out really well because one of our goals is to give students a maximum amount of variety in the 5 experiences they have with industry sponsors. There's nothing more that's going to bring variety than, you know, an international project they can put on their so we learned a lot through the experience that caused us to do things differently in the fall. So in the fall, what we ended up doing is partnering with China. The academic calendar aligned. So we didn't have that problem this time around. So we know we're only going to do fall now with Beijing partners.
Lesson learned.
We also found a prompt which was a little bit more exciting for students. We ended up pulling together an industry partnership that Beijing Normal students were working on already for an automobile manufacturer. And so they were very familiar with the Chinese automobile context, and they were also familiar with sort of their research configuration on that side. On the Purdue side, our students knew nothing about what it was like to be in China. None of them had ever been there. And even though a couple were foreign-born Chinese students. And so there was an intercultural gap there that we could actually play around with. And so their goal was to design the future of pleasurable automotive experiences with semi-autonomous vehicles in China. So very pie in the sky, even for somebody in China, much less for somebody in the United States.
Absolutely.
So we identified a few things that were really important. One was that we wanted to maintain some synchronous connection, but we're 12 time zones different from China. So that basically means you're either 8 a.m. or 8 p.m. And then it's the exact opposite for colleagues in China. And so we identified that 1 hour every 2 weeks was about the right amount of interaction. So we ended up mapping those across our 15-week semester. And then the rest of the work was done asynchronously. So each team did design sprints on their own every 2 weeks. And they picked a different context in which to sort of imagine the future of autonomous or semi-autonomous driving and pleasure and charm. And then they would swap. And then they build on each other's work for the next 2 weeks. And those moments every 2 weeks were the primary opportunities to do some translational work to figure out what did I think this context was, and I got it all wrong. And we were very open to not only misunderstanding cultural context and cues, but also then to use that misunderstanding to defamiliarize or make strange and then build upon those expectations in interesting ways as designers.
Yeah, and we make no qualms about the fact that just in time is often very difficult for those that have been raised in a US American context. We traditionally have an extremely low tolerance to ambiguity. Okay, we want things to be planned. And so this was very much an exercise for the students in handling that difference as it was for the faculty.
Absolutely. And we made no, we presented this as very core to the learning experience. I was co-designing the experience along with the students. They knew that. We were on the same team trying to figure out how to wrangle this together. It was a new project cycle, and we were trying to figure out how to do this together. So what you see here is a bit of our larger Miro board. So each one of those smaller bits is a frame. And so for every synchronous meeting, we had a new frame where we would situate the day's activities. We would identify some intercultural work that we would do together to sort of celebrate difference and figure out where the different perspectives were. And then to the right, and it goes off for quite a while, you can see the different sprint work that each team did. They could embed a PDF with all the pages, and then they could actually annotate right on top of those and ask questions and do other kinds of work there.
Yeah, and again, to bring this back a little bit, so as this group working with the international partners, we're going through this process, right? There were also other groups within the design studio that were going through it with domestic partners. And so you had this happening simultaneously.
Yeah.
And so they just had that added layer of component of the COIL.
Well, all they added really was 1 hour every 2 weeks in the evening. And it actually worked out quite well. So you can see here one example of one of the cultural activities that we engaged in together, trying to share lots of ideas on the board and then use that to spark some conversation that hopefully moved the conversation forward. Interestingly, they were joining in the morning at 8 a.m. in Beijing. And so there's my big head on the screen over in Beijing. So they were all meeting together around a table. This was in a period between COVID lockdowns there. It was still mask mandate at Purdue, and it was in the evening. So it was much easier for us to meet at a distance. So we were all joining via Zoom. I was joining from my home office, and we actually had really, really productive meetings, even though things felt a little bit splintered in some interesting ways. And as I mentioned, this online experience not only allowed for some synchronous interactions where we were doing these activities in real time, but then it became sort of the permanent archive. It became our learning management system, for lack of a better term, where students could continue to engage in these conversations after hours in between the weeks. And so here you see, a design sprint that this one is a design sprint from the Chinese team. And then one of our students said, what is a high-speed seating area? That didn't quite translate.
It's not in our vernacular.
And so they were able to figure out, oh, that's a rest stop in US parlance. And so they were able to use that to start to build a shared vocabulary and figure out how their ideas would translate or might not translate. So one final thing that I think is important to note about during COIL, I mentioned the research benefit earlier. My students commonly do research with me anyway. I often have 5 or 6 undergrads working in my research lab. And so we explicitly said, we're going to be gathering some data. We want to figure out how to do this better. And we want to share what we're going to learn through this process. If you want to be along for the ride, great. You can be a co-author in anything we produce. And so all the things that we do together are going to be shared, and we're all co-researchers together. So they participated in focus groups with each other. We sort of thought about these materials and thought about how we could frame them as research throughout the process. And then several students did actually end up as co-authors on a paper that we generated that just got published back in May of this year.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to one of the things that Diana mentioned earlier about those that are intrinsically motivated to do a little bit extra. So this would be one of those benefits, those rewards for that, as an undergraduate student to be able to co-author a paper is really important.
Yeah, it goes on the resume. I mean, that's
absolutely. Very cool. Okay, so after COIL. So this is where I step back in as an administrator and I say, how did it go? So no, we've been in contact throughout, but this is really the point to where it's important for administration, right, to listen, right, to withhold judgment, and reflect with your faculty member on what worked, what didn't work, what you can change and adapt moving forward. Yeah. So let's talk about those failures and successes.
So I mentioned some of the failures from the dumpster fire spring 2021 semester. So we learned a lot there. The important thing there is that we didn't give up and say, okay, COIL is horrible. Let's never do it again, like Andrea said. In fact, there was a lot that we could learn, and it was just the integration of the pedagogical content around the intercultural competencies. As soon as that was integrated, a lot of the problems solved themselves from my perspective. There was too much going on. There were too many stakeholders and we weren't all quite aligned with each other. So we actually simplified the approach and it made it easier for everyone. Yep. We also found a set of shared platforms that worked. We tried to use too many platforms in the spring. And so by the fall, we just standardized on Miro and it made life much, much easier for everyone. We just threw everything on the one board and everyone had a single source of truth.
And this last point is the one that makes me as an administrator really happy because as we talked about earlier, identifying that lack of online options, okay, that serves my 70% of my students that don't get that global mobility. That isn't something that we wanted to be a short-term bandage. We wanted to create these lasting opportunities to serve a population with equity. And so this last one really makes my heart happy.
Yeah, and so there were also some pedagogical learnings that not only will we use to continue doing stuff like COILs in the future, which I think have become really, really important to our program, but also figuring out what did we learn from this that is going to influence my teaching practice when I'm just at Purdue working with the students that are enrolled at Purdue. And in fact, we learned a lot in engaging in these intercultural adventures together that we've been able to bring back.
And that's the point, right? So this has happened. Now we're looking at, as an administrator, another round of how do I communicate with faculty that aren't our faculty that have already been doing COILs, have already been engaging with international partners and working for a STEM university, okay, STEM college. Okay, it's really important, I think, to speak the language that your faculty speak in meaningful ways. Okay, to throw a generalization out there. Okay, within the US context, not all of our engineering faculty are going to pursue something because it's warm and fuzzy and the right thing to do. Right? It has to have some teeth behind it. And Andrea's shaking her head like, oh, yep. Right? It has to have a proof value through data. right? And so if I can show my faculty where my students are at in terms of their ability to deal with difference on an international setting, if I can show them their intercultural competency level, and I can show them how interventions like intentional intercultural competency lessons and work through a COIL experience can increase their intercultural competency baselines, then that's communicating with data. Okay, so at our institution, it's extremely important to do that. And so that's something that I've committed to on a longitudinal scale as well as a short-term scale. Okay, so we're going to measure that because I know it's worth it and I'll buy in for the warm and fuzzy. Okay, but I want data to back it up.
Absolutely. Yes, the communicating data is super important. One of the other pieces that you can play around with data is looking at this intersectionally. And so it's not only important to say, well, these aren't just soft skills in the ways that soft skills are traditionally talked about. These are actually like core to the practice of the discipline. If you're going to be designing software or engaging as UX designer, you're going to be dealing with intercultural international teams. You just look at the dumpster fire that is Twitter right now. There's lots of stuff going on there that, you know, could have benefited from a little bit more intercultural competence. The other big thing there was actually celebrating some of the difference we already had in our program. We are 70% female within the UX design program, one of the highest, I think it's the highest percentage.
It is a high percentage in the college.
In the college, yeah. And so we want to celebrate some of those differing gender norms that are not typical, sadly, in STEM education. And so we find that our female students have higher leadership capacity already. And so being able to add the intercultural component on top, that's going to make them even greater once they go out into industry.
Yeah, and I have the data that shows that. Right, and so we can then put forth those interventions that help bring the appropriate sub cohorts to where they need to be.
And then the other thing is that because we are able to engage in these different cohorts of students, all interacting at the same in one course environment, we're able to meet students where they're at. Some of our students have never left Indiana, and some of our students come from other international destinations. And so we're able to bring those worlds together. Some of them are first generation students. Others have had parents that have been involved in higher education for a really long time. And they can learn from each other in really effective ways that are going to be a rising tide that lifts all boats.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a really good point, Colin, because a lot of our students are very much at risk of being overwhelmed by a traditional mobility experience. So they may come from a small rural community, right, within Indiana. And Purdue, at its 50,000 students, can be overwhelming. The idea of going to Beijing might as well be a trip to the moon for them. So these are small bites that can start that without raising anxiety too much.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And then I think this one is really important, and I don't pretend to be an expert at this. Follow-up is hard. Right? I think as an administrator in higher ed, follow-up is extremely difficult. I can constantly do better. My colleagues can constantly do better, but really working to show the value in the experiences through data, through testimonials is something that's important as we continue to build on these and as we continue to add more in to try and spread the word on COIL to offer more COIL opportunities like we're doing today. So the second one was internal resources. So I think as we talked about the different variety of experience, whether they're compulsory, whether they're purely undergraduate students, whether they're a mix, whether they're a standalone activity for the intrinsically motivated, whether they're one team within an entire design studio of teams, it's really important to expand your definition of global. Right. And so I work in the Office of Globalization. Right. I cannot tell you how many times people say, okay, so you guys do study abroad.
I was one of those people who thought, by the way. I was told that I was incorrect.
Kindly told.
Yes.
Okay. And so what I've been really working to do across our university is to expand the definition of global. Right. And as expand that definition of how global and intercultural competency are defined and how we can work to create more efficient engineers, technologists, designers that are better at dealing with difference. Because really that's the root of what we're getting at is how they have those skills to be able to deal with difference. And so one of the feats, the tasks that I had was to expand the definition of global within the university to include virtual exchanges, to include credit bearing or counting to be able to check boxes, that a virtual curated experience can be just as valuable, if not more, for some students, right, than a true mobility. And so to do this, we had to work across campus lines. So our university is oftentimes very siloed. Okay, what this college over here does is separate from what this college over here does. And so we had to kind of scour what was happening across campus and look for pre-existing structures, pre-existing administrative units that we could expand the definition of. Right, and so our VIP office is one that was not needed nor utilized by Colin, but a phenomenal find for all of my engineering technology professors.
You saw me frowning. I'm a bit confused. You say you're trying to widen the definition of what global means. What I get, what you tell me is you're widening the type of task that you do in your office that just happens to be called global Office of Global blah, blah, blah. So are you changing the meaning of established concepts, trying to change language in order to encompass a certain meaningful goal, or are you widening the number of tasks and the relationships with the other departments? It seems to me
expanding the acceptability of what it means for a project and interaction to be global. So in our traditional format, something that was global had to include a mobility component. And
but this is your private definition. What in your institutional context means the global experience. It's not the definition of what global means. It's your institution.
Within my context, yes. So within our university.
All right.
Yeah, absolutely. And at a university that's so enormous, I mean, it's a task, right? And so getting everyone on the same page that international interactions that are done online can fall within the administrative structures and resources that traditional mobility.
Some administrative globalization goal.
Yes.
More into internationalization goal. Okay,
Yeah.
I get it.
Okay. Does that help?
Yep.
Good. Okay. Excellent. And so we had these administrative structures that were already in place. And so working with those, our VIP project, for example, there's the VIP consortium. Okay. It's a worldwide group of a structure that engineering and technology students can join projects, research projects that are mentored by faculty mentors at Purdue University, Georgia Tech, University of Strathclyde in Scotland. So this structure existed. It has an administrative unit, it has support, it has funding on our campus. They have global partners, but they all worked siloed. They never actually interacted with their global partners. Okay, so how do we, I know, right? It's like when two children play side by side and they're not actually playing next to like with each other. Okay, and so we were able to kind of bring forth those new acceptable definitions within our campus community. Okay, same thing with funding from units like Andrea's with Silmar. Okay, so we have funding available to students, to faculty for incentives, but it hadn't included online collaborations in the past. So how do we advocate to be able to do that? Okay. And then lastly, Colin's going to talk a little bit about mentoring. And I think that that's really important because as a faculty member, I don't stand in his shoes. And he's going to be able to better communicate with his colleagues the value of it.
Yeah, so I mean, mentoring, I think, starts with wonderful staff members like Elisabeth, because I mean, we started working very early on together, and it was never on my checklist of items to do globalization work. Sorry.
That's okay. I'm offended.
You know, a decade ago, I didn't even have my passport like many people in the United States. So this wasn't on my list of things to do. And so when I started at Purdue, one of the things that really started to push me in that direction early on was just some nice gentle nudges like, wouldn't it be cool if? And you just went far enough down the road that it felt obvious, and then you just kept on going, and then suddenly you were overseas with students. And then Elisabeth and her predecessor, Robert, were very happy as a result. And so this became the same kind of relationship over time that brought me to a place where this was just obvious, and it wasn't scary anymore. And so faculty members, I think, especially within a disciplinary context, are sometimes the best people to provide some of those nudges. For somebody that wouldn't seek out the Office of Globalization or its counterparts naturally, but to say, you know, wouldn't it be cool? You have that friend that you talk about all the time over in Europe. Maybe you should do a project with them. What would that look like? And giving them some cues on what that might look like in a disciplinary context can be what it takes to actually set something up.
Yeah, and it takes that relationship with the faculty and the support and the trust and the understanding. And then lastly, I want to really pay homage to the fact that we're all here today, be it online or in person. And it's really important as an administrator to work smarter and to leverage your networks. And so, for example, the GPEA, our Global Polytechnic Education Alliance, was able to bring a multitude of stakeholders here today that maybe wouldn't have been possible just within our own units. We were able to enrich the experience, to open it by leveraging our networks. Okay, we also know that friends of friends are great connections. There will be conversations had today that are like, oh, that's, you know, that doesn't work for me right now, but let me introduce you to my colleague. And keeping that open mindset is really important. And that our networks create spaces for collaboration. And that sometimes those collaborations are one-on-one, sometimes they're in a room and a virtual room like today, and sometimes they're bigger. So I have to do a shameless plug for the Polytechnic Summit, where I hope to see feedback and presentations and faculty involvement that are results of today. It will be in Utah, beautiful part of the country, close to many, many national parks on June 7th this upcoming year. And it's a phenomenal space that was created to foment gathering and collaboration. And then Colin, I loved when you said this to me, that you're not looking for a twin. So I want you to elaborate on that.
Yeah, so I think there's this perception, at least it's a perception I had early on when I was looking at COIL as a model, that you needed to find your direct counterpart at another university somewhere else in the world. And for UX, that's actually a really difficult task. There aren't a lot of UX design programs specifically. But I think as soon as I realized, like, you don't actually need a specific twin, you just need somebody that's going to complement your students and provide them a different experience than they'd be able to have otherwise. That actually allows you to open up your world much more substantially. So, you know, with our collaborators in Newcastle, we were working with people in computing and data science. They weren't UX designers, but they were providing an experience that could then complement our students' experience back at Purdue in really nice ways. So finding those and looking for those cross-disciplinary connections rather than looking for your direct counterpart can be a really, really good starting point.
And same for the students, you're expanding their professional networks.
Absolutely. And sometimes students have a professional network they can bring to bear to connect you to new global partners that you might not have had access to otherwise. And that can be really fun as well.
That's a good point. That's a good point. And then being understanding as an administrator, because sometimes the right moment is not right now. You know, and you have to be okay with that. And it doesn't mean that it's a failure. It means that it's just not right now. And you can continue to offer support and say, all right, will you let me know when you're at that point, and we'll continue the conversation. And I think that that's really important to both in just understanding each other's scenarios, but then also on the administrative side, advocating for, you know, when we talk about deadlines for funding options, deadlines for administrative support, we have to be understanding that sometimes right now is not the right moment.
Absolutely.
That's it. Do we have any questions? That was a lot, and we don't pretend to be experts. We're just happy to share the push-pull of the relationship between the administrator and the faculty member. Yes, please.
That was really interesting. Thank you very much. You mentioned the intercultural competence area, and I noticed you're using the scale of the IDI.
Yes.
I'm a qualified administrator as well for that. I'm wondering, are you doing all of the intercultural development inventories, the IDIs, individually by yourself? Or do you have a team that's doing this? Or how are you approaching that in order to get that data? And does anybody actually listen to that data?
Yes, so those are phenomenal questions. So Purdue is what I would call a substantial user of the IDI. Right, and so we use it in a variety of different ways within the Polytechnic Institute and within other colleges on Purdue's campus. Okay, so one of the ones that you saw on the screen was longitudinal data from our incoming cohort of freshman students and their matched pairs when they graduate. And so that's an enormous project, and we just
How many match pairs?
700
It's
so
a lot,
far.
yeah.
No, 799 matched pairs so far.
What do you mean with matched pairs?
T1 and T2 pre, so they take it to, so they are coming,
Twice.
yes.
Is
Mhm.
that span
Twice at a minimum,
4 years?
4 years in between.
If they have a mobility experience or something else, they might have some data points in between as well.
Absolutely,
That's
because
pretty
then we
cool.
use it for short-term things where, for example, we're not doing individual debriefs for all of our incoming freshmen. Right?
You're supposed to actually, huh?
Not only if you give them the results. Okay, so right now we're using it for,
The results? Those
No.
poor guys.
yeah, so we're using that aspect of it for programmatic development. Our students that then, okay, requested to have an intercultural experience. Okay, then what we do is we do it for all of our, say, short-term study abroads, all of our COILs. Okay, they'll take it and we'll go through with the faculty member and do a group debrief with the students. And so they can see those types of things. And then if the students sign up for their individual debrief, then they sign up for an individual debrief with the qualified administrator.
Right, and there is a team of more than 100 qualified administrators that can do it. So there's this running calendar where people designate 2 hours of time per week, and based on the availability or the request of time from somebody who would like a debrief, they just select from that pool of qualified administrators to be able to
These
facilitate.
people
that
get
debrief.
paid to do the debriefings, or
No.
this is additional volunteer work?
This is additional volunteer work. Yep.
Service to the university as so
Yep.
much.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. A variety of different ways. We can talk more about that later. Absolutely. Other questions?
The slide with the data.
Uh-huh.
So what kind of data do you collect and how?
For our students
Yes.
to communicate with the faculty members?
Yes.
Okay, so the IDI is one of them. Okay, and so we can look at an incoming cohort of students and say, this is an on aggregate their ability to deal with commonality and difference. Okay, we also utilize the BEVI, the beliefs, events, values inventory. Okay, so that is the one that also lets us know that some of our cohorts are towards, are closer to achieving some desired learning outcomes. And we can slice and dice that one to look at our underrepresented students. We can look at that one with our female versus our male population. And so those are the type of things that we're looking at.
And there's also, so there are some of those baselines which are really useful across the entire, because just the Polytechnic Institute is over 5,000 students. So there's already quite a number of students just in that one population. But then every time we look at these shorter term experiences, whether it be a COIL or a short-term study abroad, then the faculty member that's leading that has a lot of autonomy to figure out like what are some additional kinds of data gathering that might be useful to really triangulate sort of what's happening.
Yeah.
And so for instance, I think I have this as a slide. These were the data sources from the COIL that I ran back in fall of 2021 that we used to triangulate some of the core research questions that we had about intercultural competence development.
Yeah, absolutely. So we also work with what fits for that program.
May I ask once more, so is that mandatory for all of our incoming students that they take these personality belief type assessments once when they are incoming and then progressively more often?
Yes.
And with their student ID, so as part of the administratively available database on all their achievements.
Yes, and so we only look at it in aggregate to de-identified form when it comes to that level. Okay, if students then opt in for a smaller experience, if a student wants to go down that journey of really having a mentored intercultural experience, then they will work with a qualified administrator on campus to do that. But yeah, all of the students take it during their incoming registration period and the semester.
Okay, so it's part of, it's a protected part of the database, but basically it's in there.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, thanks.
Yes.
Unless somebody else wants to go first.
Nope, I think we're good. Please.
The other question is in addition to the technical IT engineering parts that obviously play an important content role, you've identified various intercultural aspects that are important and you're even measuring it. What kind of intercultural training do you give all of these participants, including your lecturers, before they start the COIL?
So we incentivize, and I don't know, Andrea, if you want to, do you want to take this one?
Sure, you know what it is, it's more about resources and making known those resources that are available. So one of those resources is the opportunity to be trained into the Center of Intercultural Learning, Mentorship, Assessment, and Research. Silmar, here's before. You know, Silmar, what they do is curate resources online and make them available. So for example, they have external facing resources like Hub ICL. They also have something called portable intercultural modules. And they also have something called GLUE, which is global learning, understanding, and don't ask me to eat. It's probably an evaluation, but I'm not sure. And so those are really just supposed to be plug and play models for people to be able to adapt these intercultural learning opportunities, because certainly only through continuation and learning can people become experts in this space. So it's meant to just give those resources and job aids to help people in their experience of intercultural learning. But one of the pain points of virtual exchange for faculty, and I thank Elisabeth for actually bringing this, is that, you know, you have the concept of what a virtual exchange is and a COIL is, and then you have this concept of intercultural learning, but how do they go hand in hand? Because the outcome of your virtual exchange may not necessarily be to support intercultural learning, right? It can just be a benefit of a COIL experience. And so Purdue's mission, though, is to make sure that there is intercultural learning there. And so therefore, all of these resources are available to be able to do that in a plug and play model, so that it's so easy. You can't deny it.
And in general, they've been linked as well. And so for me to be able to offer a COIL, I had to do intercultural pedagogy training.
That's
through-
what I wanted-
offered through Silmar. And actually I did it.
Too, but was incentivized also.
I was incentivized. Yeah, it was a very valuable experience. I say had to because I had taken it previously, a course on intercultural pedagogy to offer study abroad. And then we had a specific one that was focused on online intercultural pedagogy that I took prior to doing COIL. And so that was actually a mentored experience. I took it over the summer between the spring and the fall semesters that I mentioned. Part of that was not only being aware of resources, but then developing a specific plan for your COIL that you take forward. I won't have to take it again, but I know that who those mentors are now. I know Andrea is now one of them. I worked with one of her counterparts in Silmar to do my previous plan. And so there's some robustness to that experience that makes you feel supported.
And we try and meet the faculty members where they're at as well. So Colin had mentioned that at first those two components were separate, and that didn't work for him, right? And his cohort. And so Colin is comfortable and competent to tackle that in an integrated fashion, but we don't expect all of our faculty to do that. And so we have the ability to have that component separated out and curated by Andrea and her colleagues.
But you said it's an opportunity, if I understood, so they're not forced.
They're not forced. They're not forced. So for example, the IPG grant that was mentioned, so one of the areas that we're working on now is anybody who wants to facilitate a virtual exchange or a COIL can, and that we will serve them in that capacity. But to capture that data and to incentivize research, and we provided this money. It's a nice large pool of money too, so that faculty would be willing to write those reports and contribute and learn the intercultural indexes that, you know, would create these virtual intercultural learning experiences. But we've also noticed that we're now bottlenecking scaling if we require every faculty member to have to participate in this IPG grant.
Yeah.
So now our next step is that we provide resources and to say, well, here's, you know, your baseline, try it out, and then here's this funding opportunity that's available for the fall semester if you agree to take IPG, but it's not a requirement.
And I think that's why the faculty to faculty mentoring is going to be crucial,
For sure.
you know, as all of this grows, so that Colin can work with the colleagues within his department, within the college to say, I think, let me listen to your thoughts. Okay, well, here's my feedback on that. Yep, okay. Awesome.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.